So Raymond Brown is a famous American biblical scholar and theologian from the 20th century. And he encouraged people to start with Scripture, to look at Scripture itself, and then see what Scripture says about how Scripture is written. Right? So use concrete evidence from actual biblical text to build theories on how inspiration works. So if we look on page 189 of Abel's text, we can look at the Gospel according to Luke. And the Gospel according to Luke is great because in the first chapter, in the prologue, the author talks about how he wrote the book. And so the first thing he says is, many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us. So he's saying there's a lot of people that are telling or even writing these accounts of Jesus Christ, the risen Christ, and the early church. The second verse he says, those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us. So again, he's talking about the way that these teachings that come from the apostles were passed on to others, and they were checked for accuracy. Right? There were people that were very concerned and were sure to see that, hey, what this person has told us is fitting with what the apostles taught. Right? So they're talking about handing down in the first century Jewish and Greek sense was a particular concept of an accurate transmission of an oral teaching. And then in verse 3 and 4, I too have decided that after investigating everything accurately anew, to write down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, or lover of God, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you received. And so Luke here is saying that he's looking at a lot of stories. He's looking at a lot of accounts, and he's trying to put them into an orderly account. He's trying to put them into one solidified story for Theophilus, which could be an actual person named Theophilus, but more likely a general term for Theo, God, Philus, lover. So a lover of God. Now that doesn't sound like a word-for-word dictation, does it? That sounds more like someone who is using reason, someone who is using their God-given abilities, and moved by God to, with a desire to share, right, the experience of the apostles, the experts, the community, right, those who also believe in those experts, and their own personal experience, which connects with it and verifies it in some way. Right? This looks like he's working through everyday human intellect, everyday human will, everyday human curiosity, but also something is moving him to connect. Something is moving him to connect with the revelation of the shared by the apostles, the truth shared by the apostles, and believe in it. So you can see, there is some kind of inspiration or movement in that he is making an act of the will, that he wants to spend his time, right, sharing the story of faith in the risen Christ. So we see other forms of inspiration. Other times when inspiration is coming through conventional human sources. Ezra quotes a Persian king. Proverbs quotes other kings and other wisdom traditions. So this would be considered not necessarily a sacred text, right, in the Jewish tradition, but the Jewish tradition is taking wisdom from other places and including it in their sacred text, right? St. Paul The way he writes, he's very concerned with everyday issues of the communities he founds. And he's writing about practical concerns, people's material welfare, the way the communities are getting along, all these things. He's writing first draft letters, it looks like, in some cases. And you see inspiration here working in an everyday practical way, right? Paul's thoughts, his concerns for his community, his personality. He was very fiery and zealous in his expression of the faith. But he saw in that, it seems, that he may have saw in that kind of inspiration, that God really was working through him. You know, he says in his writings at one point, I think that I too have the Spirit of God. And in another place he says, I live no longer I, but Christ lives in me. So although there's no indication that he thought God was directly guiding his writings, he does seem to see himself as, see his life and mission as inspired by God. Prophets, on the other hand, in many cases, reflect a more direct and less mediated experience of inspiration. So in the prophet Jeremiah, for example, he says, the word of the Lord came to me. He seems to be acting as an oracle or a medium, where God is speaking through his mouth. In one of his prophetic visions, he hears the word, see, I place my words in your mouth, right? So he's understanding that God is directly moving him to talk. People have this experience today in some Christian churches in our society, where they practice speaking in tongues. And the idea is that they are just letting go and letting God work through them. Again, kind of like you would Bluetooth music to a speaker. A lot of the prophets had prophetic visions. They saw these visions that they considered kind of like a direct transmission from God, as if they would just tune in, to God's channel and get a video and then share it with others. So these were very rather direct experiences of God. Again, they're still mediated through human thought, through human concepts, and then they still have to be shared and written down. So they're not fully direct. The idea of direct is just one we're saying more direct, right? They seem to be more obvious in their connection to being shared by God. Another factor we have to take in consideration when we are looking at the way inspiration works in the Bible is that many of the books of the Bible seem to have multiple authors. And the Gospel according to John, at the end of the Gospel, we have a testament that the things that were written down in this Gospel came from the beloved disciple, and we know that his testimony is true. So you see there's someone else is commenting on the corpus, which is attributed to, or it's attributed to coming down from, or being passed on from John, the beloved disciple. Okay, so you have at least two people working there, right? Because you have the story, you have the sharing, you have the faith of the apostle, and then someone else saying, we know that this is true. So you see there's at least two people working there. In Genesis, there's another example of multiple authors here, which we'll see working throughout the first 5 books of the Old Testament. When we see these two different accounts of creation, it makes it seem like, hey, there looks like there were multiple people or multiple groups of people working on this. We'll take a little closer look at that in a subsequent lesson. We look at Judges. Judges is a collection of oral traditions that are passed on through the people who became the Israelites and the early Israelites. And they cover stories over an 800-year period. So we look at a lot of different sources going in there, being passed down orally from generation to generation. And this is true of many books of the Bible. They're passed down orally, then written, edited, rewritten over hundreds of years. So we can't just say, okay, let's look at this person. This guy wrote Genesis. This guy wrote Exodus. This guy wrote Maccabees. We can't just sit and look and say, let's ask ourselves, how was that person inspired? There are, in many cases, generations of people contributing to the text. So does that mean they were all inspired? Well, our answer basically is yes. Pontifical Biblical Commission, which is kind of like the Catholic Bible All-Stars, includes people like Raymond Brown. They do say that all these people are in some way inspired. The inspiration that shapes Scripture is going to affect everyone involved in the process of bringing Scripture to the way that we have it now.